Hello, what's coming is an interview I did at the Red Pill Conference with Lord Monkton, primarily on the subject of CO2 and the global warming climate change issue. We also touch on a few other topics, one being he was able to go to the Vatican and discuss the issue, well, just a little bit with them, and so he talks about that. And then also I mentioned volcanoes. He gets into an interesting discussion on it, dealing with heat in the ocean, volcanoes, and CO2. Where I had really been going, or what I was thinking more of, was the dust and how that creates a blanket and a shadow effect, which has happened before, especially with the large volcano that could go off any day in Iceland. Because remember, every 150 years, the little one and the big one go off in Iceland. So we have a historical record of that. And the little one went off in 2010. So at any time in the near future, which of course could be this year to, maybe even another decade, who knows, but within a relatively short period of time, that large one should be going off, because they both went off in the mid-1800s, and there was some starvation that happened back then. So depending on what time of year it would go off and everything. But anyway, here's Lord Monkton. You can take a look at what he has to say. I'm also going to put in the description, I'll have the breaks if you want to just look at the few questions and skip over parts and take a look at it. Anyway, here's Lord Monkton. We're interviewing Lord Monkton, who's come all the way here from England. We're going to touch on some stuff with in the religious aspect, because I think that's one of the weakest parts of the truth movement, or the people who are taking on the globalists, because as Lord Monkton has said many times, this is a spiritual battle that has been foretold for millennia, actually, that is going on. So why don't you just give a little opening thoughts as to why you wanted to come, and what your overall view and strategy is for helping to lessen what is coming.
Right. So I'm here in Montana at the Red Pill Expo, to which I was invited to give my testimony on the question of whether climate change is really a problem. And I have now, in recent weeks, with my distinguished team of scientific colleagues, finally found the missing piece of a proof we've been studying for something like 11 years, that the official position on climate change is based on a significant elementary error of physics. And I was able to explain to the audience here at the very first Red Pill Expo, there will be another one here in Montana in 2018, but this was the first one. I was able to give to this audience the first indication of our result. And our result is this, that the global warming that we can expect if we double the CO2 in the atmosphere by the end of this century is, in about 150 years, a warming of approximately 1.2 Celsius degrees, or about 1/3 of the 3.6 Celsius degrees, which is the central estimate of the computer models relied upon by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And the theme of the Red Pill Expo is to take people away from the various illusions which socialism, communism, and bureaucratic centralism are trying to inflict upon them, and to expose them to the notion that if they search diligently, they can try for themselves to find the truth, and that process of honest and diligent inquiry is the essential first step, both in the scientific method and also in religion, because the end and object, both of science and of religion, is the objective truth. What do I mean by objective? Well, the objective truth is a truth which is true whether or not you or I or anyone else likes it to be true. It is true in and of itself, and if we properly discern the truth, we recognize that. Now, of course, there can be arguments about what is true, just as there are arguments, for instance, between religions, each of which believes that they have the truth, and they can't all have the truth. Indeed, if one were to do a mathematical analysis of it, one could say that at most one religion is true. But they're all striving towards the truth, and that is what science is supposed to do. But in the global warming field, the socialists and communists, the centralizers, the bureaucrats, have taken over the issue and have tried to peddle the notion of a 97% consensus. Now, the first thing is that anyone who knows anything about science knows that except on matters which have been definitively proven, such as the theorem of Pythagoras, the notion of a 97% consensus is improbable in the extreme. There are far too many doubts about the official climate change story for there to be even a consensus on the milk and water proposition, which is what the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change defines as the consensus, and they say the consensus proposition is that most of the warming of the last 50 years was probably caused by us. Now, in fact, as a paper that I contributed to you some 4 years ago, it definitively establishes, by looking at 11,944 papers published in the climate literature in the learned journals from in the 21 years 1991 to 2011, of those 11,944 papers, only 41, or 0.3%, explicitly stated that recent global warming was mostly caused by man. Why didn't the others state that? Because whether or not it is true, we don't know yet. There isn't enough evidence to establish the answer either way, and the vast majority of scientists are honest enough, therefore, not to try to produce an opinion on it. But that doesn't stop the political body, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which pretends to be but is not a scientific body, from asserting, falsely as we have now proven, that there is a 97% consensus, when in fact it's 0.3. There is no consensus that most of the warming was caused by us. Even if that were true, which it may or may not be, it would still not tell us that that rate of warming was at all dangerous, because the rate of warming we have seen over the last 27 years since 1990, when they first made predictions about how much global warming there would be by now, the warming that's happened is 0.4 Celsius. At most, it's 0.3 according to the satellites, the best record, whereas they predicted more like 0.8. So they had counted more or less double in their prediction what has occurred in reality. And so to say that there is a consensus is, objectively speaking, simply false. To say that everybody agrees with their predictions when the predictions are so far adrift from reality is also manifestly false. But the final clincher, which I gave to the meeting here, was that we can now prove, and prove definitively, by one of the most ancient and powerful methods of mathematical argument leading to a definitive conclusion, that the element in future global warming caused by what are called temperature feedbacks, not the direct consequences of adding CO2, but the subsequent consequences of the warming caused by adding CO2, those feedbacks will not in fact make very much difference to the climate, to the temperature at all. They will only put it up by at most sort of a tenth, maybe at that maximum a fifth of a Celsius degree. It's very, very small beer. And they had previously been using these feedbacks as a way of saying that instead of getting just the 1.2 Celsius that they say would be directly caused by CO2, that becomes more like 3.6. Well, no, it doesn't. It's actually still 1.2. And even that may well be a high figure, but we haven't addressed that separate question of how large what is called the CO2 forcing should be, and even if it is that large, whether therefore it would translate into the temperature change that they are suggesting. So we think it's pretty much a maximum of 1.2 Celsius of warming per doubling of CO2, which destroys any notion that there was a consensus, because the consensus was, if there was one, was simply wrong, and that if it's only that small amount of warming, there isn't a problem, and the climate scam and the climate scare are very firmly, as of this moment, over.
As a scientist and everything, one thing I'd like you to, you alluded to this paper from 4 years ago. So the first part would be
Now, is that in conjunction, because you said, I believe, I heard you say you published a paper with the Chinese, or
Yes.
is there some Chinese institute?
That was 2 years ago, yes.
Yeah, they can't hear you say that. And then the other thing I'd like you to just briefly mention, of course, is, of course, we've been warming, obviously, since the Ice Age, overall time.
Yeah.
And I'm curious if you've been looking at, it appears that all of the tectonic plates are moving. If you're looking at the earthquake swarms, like from a century ago for the first 20 years to the first 20 years or 17 years of this century,
Yes.
all of the main land masses are just surrounded with earthquakes, and the rim of fire is lighting up.
Yes.
And the role, of course, that just a few big volcanoes would play in this overall environmental and global warming scheme.
One of the questions I'm often asked is whether volcanoes in today's world are making very much of a difference to global warming, because you sometimes see reports that one volcano making a big eruption puts more CO2 into the atmosphere than man does in a year. Now, that isn't in fact true, and how do we know it isn't true? Because we can now measure at many, many locations all around the world to a very precise degree what is the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere, what is the fraction of the atmosphere by volume that is attributable to CO2. And the answer is it's around 400 parts per million by volume. And when I was born it was about 300, and at the turn of the 19th to the 20th centuries it was about 280. So it is going up, and the most likely reason for it going up is us. Volcanoes do not disturb this record very much. You can see evidence of the very big volcanoes such as El Chichon, for instance, or Pinatubo. You can see a slight spike, but a surprisingly small one, in the CO2 record when those big eruptions come. But most of the time volcanoes are erupting all the time, and they're always putting out a certain amount of CO2, and that's part of the natural background level of CO2. But the systematic adding of CO2 to the atmosphere that we are doing has been, I think it's probably fair to say, the main cause, not the only cause, but the main cause of the increase in CO2 concentration since approximately 1750, when it was around 280 parts per million, and now, as I say, just over 400. But that said, there is another influence that volcanoes can exercise, and if I were to ask you how many volcanoes are there underneath the ocean, you might think there might be a few hundred or a few thousand. There are actually more than 3.5 million, and these are disposed chiefly along what are known as the mid-ocean divergence boundaries, which are where the tectonic plates at the bottom of the ocean pull themselves apart, or are pushed apart by magmatic intrusion from below, and that's where these volcanoes and earthquakes happen most often. And of course, if the rate of magmatic intrusion should vary, and we have no means of knowing whether it's doing this or not at the moment because it's not sufficiently measured, then of course the ocean can be heated to many thousands of degrees below, and that from below by this magma coming up through these vents that are all along these 20,000 miles worth of divergence boundaries, and particularly in the tropical eastern Pacific, which is where the divergence, which is the spreading apart of these tectonic plates, is occurring at approximately 20 times the average rate around the world, and yet it's in that precise area that we get what is known as the El Nino effect, where suddenly the ocean in that region warms up and causes warming all around the planet. Now, as yet, nobody has sufficiently studied the behavior of these 3.5 million subsea volcanoes to determine whether there is a sufficient variation in their activity to explain some part of the warming that we've seen over the last 20 or 30 years. So there's no way that we can yet answer a question like that, because we haven't done the measurements, and this is one of the most important points that climate science is all too unwilling to admit. that where we do have measurements, they are usually insufficiently well resolved to be useful, or they don't go back far enough to be useful. And in most of the important areas where we should be looking to try and find out what's going on, we simply haven't been able to take the measurements at all, and therefore we can only guess at what might be happening. We can't say that it is, and we can't say that it isn't. I would suspect that if there were any systemic variation in the activity of the, for instance, the volcanoes that go underwater and indeed on land all round what's known as the Pacific Ring of Fire, then this would make a difference to global temperature. And indeed some studies by Professor Vittorito, which are not yet published in serious journals but have been published in what I think we'd better call vanity publishing journals, do suggest some superficial correlation between variations in seismic activity in these regions, which are measured by the US Geological Service, and the data are made publicly available both as to latitude and as to longitude, so you can very precisely specify the area you're looking at to see what effect it's having on regional temperature, for instance. Is there a correlation? He is beginning to do that work. In fact, it's my suggestion that he's doing it. It's a very interesting project. It is, of course, very unpopular with those who are peddling only one narrow view, that it's all to do with man and nothing else. But it is exactly the kind of research that needs to be done in order to establish a baseline from which we can see that mankind is perhaps responsible for the remainder. But of course the significance of our result in the context of this question of whether the volcanoes, both above ground and most particular under the sea, are having an impact, is that the impact of us on global warming is now known to be a lot smaller than they ever thought it could be. We can explain why global warming has occurred at only half the predicted rate. That is because their exaggeration of the effect of feedbacks on temperature have led them in the past to over-predict the rate of warming, and even though they have had to bring down their short to medium term forecasts to make them in line with the very much slower rate of warming that's been observed than was originally predicted, they have not been honest enough also to bring down the longer range forecasts of what might happen in 100 or 200 years' time. They have left those improperly and unscientifically unaltered when they have been compelled to alter the short-term forecasts. And this, frankly, is just one of the many examples of dishonesty that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and so many climate scientists seem to me to be guilty. They're not giving us a fair go. They're not doing this with sufficient objectivity. You have to be able to sit back and say, whatever our politics, whether we believe in democracy or communism, and young people on the whole tend to believe in communism, and people who are older and wiser believe in democracy, the fact is that we have to do our science impartially and objectively, and we must not claim certainty where we don't have it. We can claim it where we do. We, for instance, if we prove to be right about the large error we have found in their method of calculating how much global warming there will be, if we are right, that is a definitive and complete proof. Then we can say there is certainty that on that proposition we are right. But you can't claim certainty about the whole effect of man on climate change until you have ruled out the many natural factors which at the moment are simply inadequately and improperly measured. And until climate science goes out into the field, gets its boots dirty and does these measurements, it must stop trying to proclaim that there is certainty, because there isn't.
The last little part here, I'd like to switch now and get away from the climate, and let's get into the geopolitics and the politics and the spiritual aspect of it. You had mentioned this Hebrews 13:7 that you're sitting right next to, and so why don't you expand on your thoughts about that?
As we began this interview, the inscription that you will see just to my left, just here, on the bench I'm sitting on outside the venue in Montana for the Red Pill Expo, has begun to be lit up by the sun, and it may be that you can read it now. It's a quotation from the epistle to the Hebrews, and what it says is, "Remember our leaders who taught you the word of God. Think on all the good that has come from their lives and follow the example of their faith." Now, I am an inadequate subscriber to the Christian religion, and I'm happy to say that that is the case. I don't claim to be a good example because I'm not necessarily a very good person, but I perhaps am a little bit less bad than I would be if I wasn't a Christian, because we are at least told that there is a morality which we should follow. And one of the most distressing things that I have come across here in America in recent months is the corporate murder by the FBI and other unknown security services, together with the Oregon State Police, of an innocent citizen driving along a road in Oregon, just coming out of northern California and into southern Oregon. And just around a corner where they hadn't given him an adequate line of sight, there was a roadblock. He had to turn very hastily off the road to avoid hitting the cars on the roadblock, and he ploughed into the snow, whereupon snipers from all around surrounded him and began shouting at him that he must get out of his car with his hands up. He said, "Look, I'm not going to shoot anyone. I'm not meaning anyone any harm. Just, you want to shoot me, you shoot me, but don't shoot my wife, don't shoot anybody else. Just let me go about my business." And for 20 minutes they shouted at him to get out, so eventually he did get out and put his hands up, and then he was shot by a plastic bullet which caused him to stumble and reach down towards his flank where the bullet had hit him. That was then used as an excuse by the snipers to shoot him dead on the feeble excuse that he was reaching for his weapon. And this is a matter which requires international investigation, and I have announced here at the Red Pill Expo that I shall now be conducting an international investigation into whether this was corporate murder or whether there was a justification for what was done. I will be looking in particular at the question of why the Oregon sheriff did not give a full and proper account, not only of the live rounds that were fired, but also of the plastic bullets, so that the question of whether he'd just been shot by a plastic bullet at the moment when he was then shot with a real one has not been properly examined, I suspect because they know that the account is just as I have given it to you. And I also want to inquire, and this is why this quotation is so important, into whether the policy of the FBI set by Mr. Obama in conjunction with the all-too-willing Mr. Comey, who in my opinion was fired precisely because of his involvement in the shooting of the innocent Lavoy Finicum, Comey has put up on the FBI website, and his successor, to his shame, has not yet taken it down, a series of indicators that the joint terrorism task forces, of which there are some 103 around the United States, should look for when identifying a potential terrorist. Now, these indicators do not include that the potential terrorist is of Muslim origin, which would seem to me to be the most obvious first one on the list. That is not there, because Mr. Obama, being a totalitarian, admired the Muslim religion, which is essentially totalitarian, rather than the Christian religion, which is much more gentle and libertarian. And so the Muslims, who after all were responsible, for instance, for the 9/11 terror attack, do not figure on the list. But remarkably, on this list, in particular the version of it which was circulated to the Joint Terrorism Task Force in Phoenix, Arizona, from which I got it, I know the sheriff there, is that anyone who quotes from the Bible, like the makers of this bench, is to be regarded and reported to the Terrorism Task Force headquarters as a potential terrorist. Anyone who expresses a Christian identity, as I have done in this video, is to be regarded as a potential terrorist. Any lone individual is to be regarded as a potential terrorist. Anyone, remarkably, who quotes from the Constitution of the United States is to be regarded as a potential terrorist. Anyone who, on being stopped by the police, asks why he has been stopped and on what authority, is to be regarded and reported as a potential terrorist. Now, what would the effect, the practical effect, setting aside the immorality of defining Christians as automatically potential terrorists, consider the practical consequences of this absurd and profoundly politically motivated instruction, which almost certainly came from Mr. Obama, who shouldn't even have been the president. But the consequence of that is that there are almost certainly 2 members of the Joint Terrorism Task Force for Montana sitting in this meeting here because they have heard that people like me, who speak about the US Constitution and are Christian and can quote from the Bible in 3 languages, we are terrorists. Now, the fact that I've never killed anyone nor shown the slightest sign of doing so doesn't seem to have anything to do with their current definition of a terrorist. So what is happening is that these Joint Terrorism Task Forces are now busy chasing around the country after every Christian pastor they come across, that they don't therefore notice things like 9/11. And so the diversion of time and effort and concentration away from the real terrorist risks and towards the virtually non-existent terrorist risk that your average Christian poses is at the administrative level an absurdity, and at the moral level an outrage. And one of the reasons why Lavoy Finicum was shot was that he has been known to quote from the Bible. He has been known to quote from the Constitution. And he has been known to carry arms. Another of the, you carry arms, which your Constitution expressly allows you to do, then you are regarded as a potential terrorist. So practically everybody in the United States is now regarded officially by its governing bureaucracy, the FBI, as a potential terrorist. Now, you can imagine how utterly absurd that is, and how hopeless it is that they're wasting their time chasing around after Christians, because although it has not been unknown for Christians to go completely against the Bible and commit wholesale murder, we must accept that this does happen. The notion that just because you're a Christian you are likely to do that is to get your maths wrong, because if you say that 2/3 of this country is practicing Christians, which is a kind of guess, you're looking at certainly 200 or 300 million people who are Christians, of whom perhaps 10 every decade might pose a terrorist threat. 10 out of several hundred thousand. That's several hundred million, I should say. That is not a good batting average for you to go out and investigate every Christian because they're a Christian. I mean, you'd just run out of resources before you tried, and the diversion of effort is irresponsible. But the consequence of Lavoy Finicum, and I've seen his broadcasts on YouTube because they're part of the investigation I'm about to conduct, and they seem to me to be entirely blameless, moderately and generously and gently expressed. He's not agitating or asking anyone to come forward and be violent or to kill anyone. And a terrorist act is one where you are either advocating or, still worse, practicing the killing of innocent citizens on the basis that they do not share some belief that you hold passionately. And so, because of this absurd doctrine that the people like those who carved this bench are to be regarded as potential terrorists, when Lavoy Finicum was stopped and he was carrying a weapon, they felt that they could shoot him for what they later said was, well, he had committed federal offences. And not one of the journalists at the press conference where the Oregon sheriff came out with this shameful account thought to ask. They must have been hand-picked by the sheriff not to ask questions. They sat there like dumb puddings. Not one of them asked what federal offences had he been thought to have committed. When had he been told that he was guilty of those offences? If he hadn't been told before, why hadn't he been told before? Or is it the case, and of course this was true, that he hadn't actually committed any offences, federal, state, local or other? They wanted to stop him because of the FBI doctrine that he believed in the Constitution, didn't believe that the federal government was right to own 1/3 of the land area of the United States when the Constitution says they can only hold 10 square miles in Washington, D.C., plus another little bit here and there for forts or ports. And he's quite right to point out that the Constitution says that. It's never been repealed. That is still the supreme law of your land, and yet the federal government government acts in open defiance of that law. He's perfectly entitled to say that. That does not make him an actual or potential terrorist. He said it in the mildest and most sensible of terms, as anyone who watches his videos on YouTube will at once agree. So the press did not ask the right questions because they no longer have the moral fibre or independence of the governing establishment to hold it to account even when they start going around shooting innocent US citizens and asking questions afterwards. So the press, the so-called fake news media, who are simply an extension of communistic, dictatorial, centralist, tyrannical power, they are themselves partly guilty after the fact of Lavoie Finicum's murder because they did not bother to ask the public authorities any of the questions that any normal, halfway alive journalist would have asked, because they were politically on the same side as those who thought that anyone who dares to speak out for freedom against the socialist tyranny that the bureaucratic class in this country wishes to impose should not be allowed to speak freely, as Lavoie Finicum gently but firmly and quite frequently did. So one of the most important aspects of the Red Pill Expo, when we are looking at these moral questions of for instance, the link between science and religion, in that science and religion, each in its own way, is or ought to be in pursuit of objective truth. That's what it should be for. And therefore it is not for any government to trammel or control honest and independent scientific or religious enquiry. What should be controlled and opposed is the growing tendency among the hard left factions, and particularly among crazed young people who have been radicalized by these communistic and socialistic factions, to deny to those who disagree with those factions the right to exercise free speech responsibly, as Lavoie Finicum did in saying there is another, a gentler and a better way.
So my last question is, I know that you went to the Vatican to discuss these issues with them. I would just like you to enlighten us to like who you spoke to and,
yes,
and just how the meeting went.
Yes. I think a couple of years ago now, I was invited by the Heartland Institute, which is a think tank based in Chicago, to go to Rome with a delegation it was putting together to discuss with the Holy See, and in particular with Monsignor Sanchez Sorondo, the prefect of the Pontifical Scientific Academy, the question of global warming, because the present Pope, unlike his predecessors, has decided to adopt a political line on the scientific question, and in doing so he has made a number of elementary errors of science, and I had been given an advance copy of his encyclical letter, a letter to all the people in the world in which he said these things that were wrong. And so I wrote to the Holy See and said, look, there are mistakes in this letter, you need to correct them, and here are the professors who will talk to you about each of them. These have the specialist knowledge and they will give you a fair, balanced and independent account of what the true science is. I did not get a reply, of course, because anything that goes against the party line in the Vatican isn't necessarily welcome there. They don't do dialogue. And that was a shame, because the Church has very strict rules about this. If this were a matter of faith or morals, then the Pope would be right to pronounce and to say it is for me to assent and not to question. But when it's a matter of science on which the Pope does not have any divine authority to preach to us, then it is improper for his staff to reject very clear evidence that what he was about to say was wrong, and to refuse to talk to the eminent professors of science, all of whose contact details I had supplied, so that each of the 7 major errors of scientific fact that were in the 7 statements made by the Pope, every single utterance by the Pope in this encyclical on the climate was simply wrong, so that they could realize that these statements were wrong and modify them so that without losing his point that we should, like his namesake St. Francis of Assisi, take care care of and respect the environment around us, a point which he fairly made in the encyclical, he should have confined himself to that and not engaged inadequately in the socialist politics, which were, of course, his background. Essentially, his background was a communist background. And one sometimes fears that on the question of the climate, he put his communist background in front of his religious obligation to stay out of political and scientific disputes, and instead confine himself solely to the moral high ground, which is where the Holy See belongs. Now, that is not to say that I think he should be removed as Pope, or we need a more reactionary or conservative Pope. The Holy Spirit has his reasons when helping the cardinals to choose the Pope, and after two really very conservative popes, there was a need for the Church to reach out once again to the very socialist and chiefly the young people's faction, which increasingly turns away from religion and towards the substitute for religion, that is communism. And of course it was fair enough in those circumstances that the Holy Spirit should, acting through the cardinals, have chosen the present Pope. And I don't mind that it's now their turn when we've just had two goes with our turn. I don't mind that. But I do think that he needs to be very careful in future that he should take a more balanced view. Now, I had lunch with the prefect of the Pontifical Academy and with Italy's most eminent scientist, Professor Antonino Zichichi, a few years previously in the splendid painted hall of the Pontifical Academy, which is set in the middle of the Vatican gardens. It's one of the most agreeable city centre locations in the world. And I found Monsignor Sanchez Sorondo very much as urbane and delightful and clubbable and charming, as we would say in Britain, as I had expected. But I found him to be unexpectedly intolerant of scientific balance on the climate change question. And from this I deduced, correctly as it turned out, that he was a Marxist first and a Christian second. And he couldn't believe his luck that at long last the Marxists had taken over in the Vatican. They'd tried before and had never previously succeeded. And you had a Marxist Pope, essentially, in his political utterances about climate change. He was reflecting the Communist Party line, and he'd got this from Sorondo, who is himself very much in that direction. And I think the danger is that whereas conservative popes will always appeal to the authority of the Bible and of Scripture and of the words of our blessed Lord and of his example and of that of his saints, you don't get this so much with the communistic faction. They tend to put their communism first, and they will use communistic arguments rather than theological ones in justification of their point of view. And that's really the impression, whether fair or not, that I got from Monsignor Sanchez Sorondo. I'm conscious he's not here to answer for himself, so I mustn't push that for more than it's worth. But I think it's fair to say Professor Zichichi probably shared my view. He didn't find that Monsignor Sanchez Sorondo was as accommodating to having a discussion about this as we thought at the scientific level he should have been. And so when I went to the Vatican a couple of years ago, I did go to the Pontifical Academy, because in fact in my capacity as a journalist, I still write for various publications from time to time, I had got accredited to a meeting that they were holding at the Pontifical Academy with the Secretary General then of the United Nations, who was Ban Ki-moon from Korea. And I met Ban Ki-moon and shook him by the hand, and I said, look, Your Excellency, please be a little careful about the climate issue. I can understand how attractive it is to the UN because it gives the UN a reason for existence, a reason for extending its tentacles into governments, and of course the attractiveness I understand, but the science is collapsing, and in the end the UN could collapse with it if it goes too much further down this road. And he looked rather startled, and his chef de protocol turned up and said, why didn't you come through me? I said, because if I had, I'd never have got to say what I've just said to him. And so eventually I went back to the main conference chamber and sat and listened for a bit, and then Sanchez Sorondo saw that I was there, and so he called for his attendants to have a look at my credentials, and I was then chased out of the chamber and told that I shouldn't be there because the press were supposed to be outside and not sitting in the chamber itself. So I was chased outside, and But nevertheless, I had the opportunity to have a quick word with the Secretary-General and with one or two Vatican officials while I was there, just to say to them it may be a good idea to take a more nuanced approach to this climate question and don't go too nap on the official Climate Communist Party line, because that's really what it is. We're not talking of science here, we're talking of totalitarian politics, using and co-opting environmentalism as a means of pursuing its anti-capitalist objectives, and its objectives of taking over from capitalism and then introducing a kind of ghastly, grim Soviet-style communism worldwide. And I find it astonishing that the Church should have fallen for this in the shape of the present Pope, and in particular Monsignor Sanchez Rondeau. They really ought by now to know better than that. So we did convey this opinion to them, and what was interesting was we got an enormous amount of coverage in the press for this, because there was a widespread feeling in the press that maybe we were actually right about this, because we weren't saying the Vatican should express our point of view. We were saying, by all means, say that you think as a person that the science points in a particular direction, but do not, in an encyclical letter carrying the authority of your office, make elementary scientific mistakes, which are easily refuted, because it makes not only you look stupid and feeble-minded, but it makes the institution that you represent look stupid and feeble-minded. You damage the papacy by straying into an area of science which is not the job of the papacy, and you demean the institution by doing so. And that got a lot of traction with the press. So I think the Holy See has done itself no favours by adopting the line that it has on the climate question. And of course the Pope had a meeting with Angela Merkel quite recently to encourage her to go on banging away about the climate. Well, she was from East Germany, so she has a communist background. She sees it the way the climate communists do. But the significance of my paper, which will eventually be posted up at whatsupwiththat.com, WATTS, upwiththat.com. It'll be many months yet, because we've got to get it through peer review and into the journal first. But the significance of our paper, if we are right, and we can't absolutely say for certain that we are until the paper has got through peer review, has been published, and has been not overturned by the scientific community. Once that has happened, then I think we will be able to say to people like the governments who have signed up to this and have spent trillions of their taxpayers' money entirely pointlessly, as we now know, on trying to make non-existent global warming go away. I say non-existent, there's been a little, but it's only half what they said it would be. I think this is going to come to an end very quickly. The Holy See is going to look foolish for having backed the wrong horse. The governments who have with alacrity also backed the wrong horse will be seen to have been instinctually totalitarian rather than scientifically objective and politically diligent in studying this question. And there will be red faces all round, in particular in the academic community, which, being largely communist, immediately signed up to the party line and began demanding that people should be sent away from the universities or interfered with or even killed, as one university professor said, if they dared to question what we have questioned and we have now found and proven to have been wrong for 120 years. So there it is. God bless you all. God bless America.
Thank you for everything you do. Thank you for your time, and I'm sure we'll cross paths again, my friend.
Real pleasure.
And next time, spend a little more time in Montana.
Of course.
That's the whole reason I came here.
If I can, I will.
So we do have a problem. But where does this ideological monoculture, for that is what I called it, and you can see them wince as I used that term, the ideological monoculture of totalitarianism come from? Well, it comes from the notion that there is no truth beyond the party line, which has, of course, been excitingly rebranded as the consensus. And it was this man, whom I bet nobody can name. This is Ion Mihai Pacepa. He was the head of the Securitate, the secret police in Ceausescu's Romania. And what he did was to set up a thing called the Disinformation Directorate, the Государственная Desinformatia, if you happen to want it in Russian. And their job was solely to go around denigrating the reputations of anyone who was affected in opposing communism nationally and internationally. And I knew that they were doing this even when I was at Cambridge. What I didn't know was the scale, and we only discovered that when he came out to the West, and only now can I talk to you about it because I was under the 30-year rule of secrecy until now. But he came out and he told us at his debriefing that he had recruited, anyone like to guess how many Western willing communists in the 40 years he did this, whose sole job was just to be beastly in the press and in the media and everywhere they could to the opponents of communism. 1 million Western agents of influence. They were not paid. Most of them never even heard from him directly. He couldn't possibly control that many. They were taught to brief their successors. That is why even when the KGB and the Disinformation Directorate disappeared, they still went on recruiting each other and carrying it on. And that is why so very rapidly the mainstream media, for instance, became the Marx Street media. That's how it happened. And there's his book, so you can now read about this. It's now at last public, and you can see for yourself where this sudden upsurge in totalitarianism in the West came from. So much so that openly, for the first time since the Berlin Wall came down, the Communist Party of Denmark was willing to parade in the streets of Copenhagen outside the 2009 climate conference, and there is a picture taken at that demonstration. So now with that background, we can start looking at the climate scan. And I shall be making an announcement here that has not been made anywhere else before, because it is an announcement of a result that we have very recently come upon, which will completely bring to an end the climate scan. Now, why should we in any case doubt that there is this consensus that we're always talking about, this 97% consensus? Well, what happened was this. A group of communists, and they were quite open about being communists, at the University of Queensland, and some in America and some in Britain, got together. These were climate change extremists. And they decided that they would review 11,944 papers on climate and related matters, published since 1991 to 2011, 21-year period. And they would see how many of these stated explicitly in their abstracts or summaries at the beginning that global warming of recent decades was mostly caused by us. Notice there's nothing in that official definition of consensus that says anything about it being dangerous. The consensus position, simply, it is in the IPCC documents, is that most of the warming of recent decades was man-made. Now, I don't know whether that's true or not, and nor does anyone else. But they wanted to say that there was a 97% consensus who had said that it was true. They published their paper to a fanfare of international publicity. Mr. Obama issued a tweet saying, "There you are, told you so, global warming is real, man-made and dangerous." Of course, they didn't even mention danger in their survey, but he thought he would tack that on just for fun. But what were the actual figures? After 3 weeks of bullying, I made them produce their list of all 11,944 papers and how they marked them up. Now, would you like to know how many papers they'd marked up as actually saying that recent warming was mostly man-made, or words to that effect? It was 64 papers, or 0.5% of the sample. I read those 64 papers, and only 41 of them had said what they said they'd said. And that's 0.3%. So the true consensus, as you see on the screen there, 0.3% instead of the 97% that they claim. They had simply lied, and I'm going to use that word very clearly. They lied. They deliberately misled the world science. And the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change lies as well. Here is an example. This is an accurate representation of the temperature record done by the Hadley Centre and the Climate Research Unit in East Anglia in Britain. And it shows the temperature change since 1850 until 2005. They used this 3 times at least in the 2007 third assessment report of the IPCC. That's the fourth assessment, I'm sorry. Now, what they've done is they've overlaid 4 separate trend lines on it, and each starting further back than the last, and all arriving at what was then the present in 2005. And you'll see that the most recent of those trend lines is the steepest. And on this slender evidence, they said that the rate of global warming was accelerating and that we were to blame. Now, the truth of it was that if you look at the graph a little more carefully, you see there were 2 other periods when precisely the same rate of warming was observed. And therefore there had been no acceleration. Yes, there is a general increase in temperatures that's been going on since 1979, roughly. But you can see actually that these two previous periods were at precisely the same, within the statistical area, precisely the same rate as the most recent one, which then promptly stopped, and we had 17 years, in fact 19 years, very nearly, with no global warming at all. So this graph was bogus, and I, as an expert reviewer for the IPCC, wrote and told them so, and said, you must correct this. This is a bogus use of statistical technique. It is incorrect, and you must correct it. And here's the point. They refused either to correct it or to justify it. So we're not dealing with science when we're dealing with these people. And indeed, you can take a sine wave. What is the trend of a sine wave? It is by definition a zero trend. It's that arrow there. But if you use IPCC's technique, you can apply those four. Look, they even use the same colours as we have. And you'll see that you can make that sine wave look as though it is not only on a rising trend, but on an accelerating rising trend. That shows how bogus their technique was, and they refused to correct it. But they have begun to have to admit that the rate of global warming isn't as fast as they had predicted. In black is their predictions, in black is observation, and in red and in blue, as you see there, is the rate of warming that they had predicted. They had overshot. And this is in I think the fourth or fifth assessment report of the IPCC, but it's the size of a postage stamp. I've had to enlarge it so that you can actually see it, because they're so unwilling to reveal this. And if we compare their predictions in their first assessment report of 1990 with what has happened since on 5 separate data sets, you see that what happened down at the bottom there has no relation to what they predicted. The rate of warming is about half, perhaps less than half, of what they had predicted. And have you seen that fact in any of the mainstream media? No, they don't tell you about this. And in fact, there are the figures. And you can see that they predicted getting on for 0.8 Celsius between 1990 and 2016, and actually it's only been 0.4. And you can see that as a result of this, they have adjusted downwards their short-term climate predictions very considerably. You can see the original predictions in red there, overlapping with the green one in yellow. The green one is what they now predict, and the blue is the observation. So they brought the short-term predictions down to match observation, but they've left the long-term predictions unaltered. Now that is scientifically dishonest. And so who must we convince that global warming is in fact really no problem? First of all, of course, the mainstream media. They need to be convinced. And I'm going to propose to you that we can actually convince them. Mr. Schwarzenegger needs to be convinced. There he is saying that climate skeptics like me should be made to put their mouths to the tailpipe of a truck with the engine running and see how we like it. He doesn't seem to understand the difference between carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide. And Google refused to take that deeply offensive hate speech video down. So I now urge all of you to do as I have done and to boycott Google and all its products and all its We also have to convince Waxman and Markey, whom I have elevated to the peerage, because then they'll have no effect on politics ever again. We have to convince Mr. Tillerson, who was the CEO of ExxonMobil, who decided that rather than backing the industry that he was in charge of, he would instead back those who opposed it. Goodness knows why, and he was now, as you know, he's Secretary of State, and he has been one of the big voices trying to stop Mr. Trump from withdrawing from tariffs. And these were the other two. You have Ivanka and, of course, her husband, Jared. These are Manhattan illiberals. And so and then, of course, the other one there on the right is Al Gore. And we can convince these two. And what about trying to convince even the most extreme extremists on the left, appropriately enough, Mr. Obama, and on the extreme left, so far to the extreme left, he's gone round to the right, is John Cook, who is the author of that ghastly paper pretending there was a 97% consensus when they knew it was only 0.5. And he likes to dress up in Nazi uniform. I don't know why, but this is what the communists do these days. They like to have an affinity with other totalitarian regimes. That's why they're all so close to the Islamic extremists. It's all totalitarians standing together against the rest of us. Can we convince even these people? Well, yes we can. And there is a way to compel the assent of all parties in the climate debate. Now, So much of the debate so far in climate science has been conjectural. It's been guesses. This is a conjecture about another subject in mathematics known as the go-back conjecture, and I've made a conjecture about that conjecture. And it's a very interesting conjecture, and it's a very interesting conjecture about a conjecture, but we can't prove it. And so we shouldn't start saying, well, science is settled, but it isn't. And we can then use a very simple proof by contradiction, and this is Socrates' method originally. It became in the Middle Ages reductio ad absurdum, which is logically equivalent to proof by contradiction. And here is that proof by contradiction. Today's temperature 288 Kelvin. Without the natural greenhouse effect, it would be 255 Kelvin. The natural greenhouse effect is 33 Kelvin. Divide that by 288. That is the absolute maximum feedback fraction that could exist. It's 0.12. It cannot be bigger than if you assume that all of the natural greenhouse effect is caused by feedback, which of course only about half of it is at most. So that's the absolute maximum it can be, and that means that if you feed all that into the equation I've just shown you, the maximum value of the feedback fraction is less than 0.12, and therefore final climate sensitivity, even after feedbacks have operated, is the same as before the feedbacks operated. It's about 1.2 Celsius. And that is all, not the 3.5 that is their central estimate. This is breaking news, ladies and gentlemen. This has never been announced before. You are the first to hear it, and you are the first to have heard that formal and complete, though very simple and very short, proof that this is the case. Thank you. Now, how have we verified this? First of all, we sent it to Professor Will Happer, who has a brain the size of the planet Jupiter. And he said, it's too long. So we sent it back and shortened it. He said, I like this paper. Then we sent it to Professor J. Ray Bates, who is the expert on the application of feedback mathematics in the climate. He's written papers on it all the way since 2007. He knows a lot about it. And he said, the paper has a strong logic. I recommend that it should be published. So that's pretty good. Then one of our co-authors, John Whitfield, built an electronic circuit in which he could test our understanding of the feedback theory, and our understanding proved correct. So then we went to a government laboratory somewhere. I'm not allowed to say where. I got a letter from them just yesterday saying, no, you can't tell anyone who we are. You can use the results we've got, which incidentally confirm in every particular what I just told you. But you mustn't say it was us, because they're running scared of the left. This is to what science has been reduced. So I can't tell you who it was. I can tell you that it was a government laboratory, and that this is an authoritative result, and they have effectively said that the theory we're using is correct. Not quite the same as saying that that theory is applicable to the climate, but in fact it is. We've checked that, and Professor Bates says there's no doubt about it whatsoever. So the consequences of low sensitivity, if we look at what present value is, you reduce an income stream over a future period to present value, is that Stern, remarkably and very stupidly, in his Stern report on the economics of climate change in 2006 from the UK Treasury under Tony Blair, and he got a peerage for this, assumed as his central assumption that there was a 1 in 10 chance that the world would come to an end by 2100 because of global warming caused by us. And now that you've seen how little global warming is going to be, you see how laughable that was. As a result, he used an artificially low discount rate, and as President Klaus of the Czech Republic said, if you do that, then the consequence is that you harm future generations by messing up their inheritance. And what they should have done, therefore, is to use the minimum market discount rate, not the 1.4% that he used as an annual discount rate, but 5%, or the US Treasury actually uses 7%. If you use the 5% rate, then his 3% cost, GDP cost, of not doing anything about global warming falls to 0.5%, and that's before you take into account our corrections. With our corrections, and the very small amount of global warming that's going to come, it is actually beneficial to get all those coal-fired power stations roaring away. The bottom line in all this is that the truth will prevail. And of course, we are not the first to be put on trial in this way. Here is the Lord of Life, in a wonderful picture by Mihai Munkachev. You see in the cynical expression on Pontius Pilate's face how little he and the governing class generally is interested in the truth. In this even more devastating sketch by Rembrandt, the Lord of Life is ignored altogether, while Pilate, who dresses himself in native costume of the day, instead of even wearing his red uniform, is talking busily to the high priest. and not paying any attention to the truth at all. Only in this, one of the earliest representations in the Renaissance of this famous show trial, is Pontius Pilate, there on the right, showing a real interest on what the Lord of Life is saying. And you'll see that the shrieking pressure groups have been relegated to the background. And if there is a better metaphor for what we're trying to do here than that, then there it is. And I think that we should do, and adopt as our motto for our new university, the remark that provoked Pilate to say, quid est veritas, what is the truth, and then march out, because he wasn't in the end really interested. Though Duccio di Buoninsegno, who painted this in the 13th century, thought that he should have been and painted him accordingly. And what had provoked this remark by Pilate were the words spoken in Latin by the Lord of Life, because he was being tried by Rome. And he was asked, what he was doing, are you a king? And he said, you said I am. And then he said this, Ego in hoc natus sum, et ad hoc veni in mundo, ut testimonium perhiber veritatem. To this end was I born, for this cause came I into the world, that I should bear witness to the truth. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is what your founding fathers wanted, that is what we want, and the truth shall set us free. God bless you all, and God bless you all.